Well, here we are in lesson 15. We've made it here to the end of the course, and we've just got a few more things to cover to wrap up what we needed to, for you to understand in order to do your final project. So in this lesson, we're going to talk about sending and receiving data, and that's more on interacting with server-side RESTful services using AJAX. So you may recall where we left off at the end of lesson 14. Was with the HTTP verbs that you can use, the get, post, put, and delete verbs, and how each one of those kind of had a different um, purpose in a service. So a service would be like an API that we're calling that's going to serve up data to us. And so with a GET request, we're going to be loading data from the service. So we might be getting a single item, or we might be getting many items. It just depends. Whereas when we're going to be posting, putting, or deleting, we're usually dealing with one particular item. With post, we have a new item. With put, we're updating an existing item, and with delete, we're deleting an existing item as well. So in this case, we want to move on and talk about how we actually package data to send with those requests, whether it's filtering or sorting, filtering or sorting that we send with our GET requests, or the actual data that we're updating in a put request, or new data we're adding with a post. So we often send data to a surface from one of the following situations. We will manually compile the data in our script based on settings that we know we need for the service, such as filters or sorts for a get all request. Or we use some variable from the system in order to obtain a specific request, such as a get one, a put, or a delete. And another option is that we might serialize data from a form to send along with a post or put request. We're going to look at examples of each of these next. So that first one is compiling the data manually. So what you can see here is I'm using the AJAX method to send a GET request to the user Lego endpoint. And for the data, I'm passing in an object that has a filter property and a sort property. And in both of these cases, I am just using straight up strings to specify exactly what I want. The only difference between the two sides is that on the left side, I create that object in line right there at the data property. On the right side, I create my object ahead of time and store it in the REQ data, probably short for required data or request data. And then when I make the AJAX call next, I just pass that variable in instead of the whole object on the left side. So two different examples. Let's look at these in my actual application. So an example is here right at the top where we're dealing with adding a Lego, in that you can see right here I am passing my data in more or less directly by property. So where did each of these things come from? Well, the Lego ID came from right up here where I went to the item with an ID of Lego search and retrieved its value. So that is actually this field right here. So I retrieve that value, and then current user and default type are variables that I declare in advance up here. So that's an example of where we're kind of compiling the data manually. All right, another example is doing something called using system variables. And the idea here is that our variables are actually coming from things that we kind of programmed into the markup itself. So you can see a hyperlink here, and I use this attribute, the data-item attribute, and I set it to 3. That's probably actually the item's ID number or something like that. And the idea here is that with HTML5, we have the opportunity to create our own attributes. We just prepend them with the word data and a dash, and then we can put anything else we want after that. So data-item is my custom attribute in this case, and I'm using it to store the ID for the item that I want here. So with that hard-coded into the markup, so to speak, now when I have a click happen on this hyperlink, I can, let's see, we've got the element in the e.target there, so that's stored in the variable $target. And then we retrieve the item ID by going to the target and getting its attribute, which attribute? The data item attribute. So in this case, the number 3 would be stored in item ID. And then we can use it in our service call on the following lines. Okay, so let's look at some examples of that in our code. So first of all, let's see a couple places where we're doing that. So keep in mind these are handlebars templates. So in a place like this right here, we have used a custom attribute, data-lego, and I'm assuming that's going to be the unique ID for this Lego item. And so the ID for that item would be stored right there. So this is actually the list of Legos here. I can look at it now in the actual live browser version, and there you can see Lego 4, Lego 1, Lego 5, etc. So it's a way of storing that Lego's item, that unique ID right here. Well, where's that helpful? Well, it's very helpful for when I click on this and I want to pull up a modal window to see more details about that particular one. Well, I'm listening for clicks over here on those things. So we're listening for clicks on A tags inside of body. And if the class or if the tag has a class of view Lego, then we're going to get the ID for that Lego by traversing to the targets attribute, the data Lego attribute. And then we use that to make a service call. And we're going to call the load Lego viewer function that I've defined above as a result. All right, so that's one example where having put this guy right on here, we were able to access it as a system variable, so to speak. Another case is over here in the modal that pops up where we want to be able to change types. So in this case, we've got the ID for the type that we're changing, and we want to make sure that it applies to the Lego in which we're selecting that type. Okay, so the view, or the template here, has those data type IDs encoded on the actual buttons. You can see that here. There they are, type of 1, type of 2, 3, and 4. Then we also have the Lego ID itself up here on the container, the ID of view Lego. So way up here on the ID of view Lego, there we have the Lego ID. So if I switch over to a different Lego, try again. You can see now we have a different Lego ID right there. That's Lego 4 now. Okay, so those values are changing because we have a smart template that's injecting that data. And how is that useful? Well, when we listen for clicks on those type buttons, and we call this change type function, here we're passing in the target, that's the button that was clicked, and so we can get the type ID directly on that button, and we can get the user's Lego ID by traversing from the target up to the thing with an ID of view Lego, and get the data Lego attribute off of it. All right, so we've grabbed those two values there, and then we pass them in different places. All right, so that was the second of 3 ways. The third is serializing form data. And so there's a simple way of doing this when all we want to do is pass that data from the form on straight on with our AJAX request. So you can see here I've used the jQuery serialize method, and this is of course assuming that we're starting with a form whose fields names all match the corresponding entity properties. In other words, the fields in the form have name attributes that match exactly the actual field names for the entity I'm working with. In this case, it's probably a Lego, and there's a specific structure that I would prescribe. You will be able to tell these things by looking at the documentation for the program that you're going to be writing, both for the exercise that you have now for exercise 13, as well as for your final project. All that to say, this is the simple way where we serialize that form data. Basically, we're clicking submit, and then we're traversing up to the form that was submitted, and we're calling the serialize method, storing that in form data. Well, this retrieves that data in a particular format that you can pass straight in to your service call here on the data property. However, it's not exactly great if you want to do any manipulating of that data or adjusting any of the settings. So another option is to use a serialized function like this, and that is if you first select the form, then you can use this function to convert the data that you've serialized and then convert that data into an object form. The object will actually match the structure of the form itself, and then it's actually very nice to work with. So we will see, I believe we can look at, actually I don't think I have an example of either of these that's really easy to read in the application that I have up here, but you will get to use something like this in the exercise 13. Okay, so those are the three different things we can do in terms of packaging and sending data. Now we need to cover a few just little items in terms of what we do with data when we get it back from the service. So we most often receive data from a service in the form of JSON text. And that's really literally what we mean. It is plain text. So we first must convert it to an actual JSON object, and then we can use it for processing or to populate a handlebars template. Now we do that like you see in this pattern here, where we're declaring a variable and we're assigning to it $.parse JSON, and we're passing into that the JSON string that we want to be parsed. Okay, so here's an example of this in play where we've made a service call, we've gotten our results back in this success function in the form of the variable data. Now we're just redefining data to be the parsed version, and then we can inject it into our template a few lines below. All right, so let's take a look at that in play, and we'll actually be able to see what it looks like before we parse and after we parse it. So I have an example down here where after we've searched for a Lego, we get a result back. Let's see, where did that go? Oh yeah, here it is, 140. Okay, so let's look at the data before. And we'll look at data after the parsed JSON. So note that just between these, we're redefining the data property that's being passed in here to be the parsed JSON version of that data. All right, let's go take a look. Go to the console so we can see. All right, so as I type in an actual Lego option here, so notice that it's getting a null object. So that's not an actual object. Oh, 75174. Okay, so notice that the before is just a long string, whereas the after is an actual object that we can package and play around with. So that's the form that we need it in when we want to do a handlebars injection. And so that's the handy thing about the parse JSON. So just a little thing that you want to know as you're receiving that data is that it's helpful to parse it. Pretty simple, right? All right. Last up, we have a few more things in terms of working with handlebars well. And the first one here is that we can actually preload handlebar templates to save some time throughout our application. So it can be much more efficient to load all our handlebars templates at the start of the application, compile them, and store them in global variables that you can call when needed. This way, we don't have to reload them every time we need them. We can declare variables, so there's kind of a three-step process here. We're first going to declare the variables at the outermost level, that's the global level, and they're going to hold, they're going to eventually hold the compiled templates. Then we're going to declare a preload function that will load, compile, and store each template in its global variable. And last of all, we can call the preload function right inside the DRE to make sure that they all get loaded, and then those variables will be available for us to use. So here's the idea. See at the very top there, we have declared two template variables. And if you didn't know that, you can simply declare variables without assigning anything to them. And if you're declaring several variables in a row, you can simply separate them each by a comma. So two variables declared, done. Next, we've defined our preload function. So we have inside of this called two get requests that go to each respective template file. And when the template data is received, we store it in its global variable. See how Lego TPL and Lego Editor TPL are both used again? Because they're declared at that outermost level, they are global variables, and we are just modifying them inside of this function. So we're storing the compiled version of each of them in their respective variables. Then inside of the DRE, we simply call that preload function that will actually make sure that this actually happens. So of course, when we define it up above, it isn't actually called. It's only when we call it in the DRE that it is actually processed. All right, so having processed that, then anywhere else in our script that we want to make use of either of those compiled templates, we can just call those variables. So you can see, last of all here, we have an AJAX request. And on success with that data back, we're parsing the data and then injecting it into the Lego TPL template. And then we're kind of adding that template into the thing with an ID of tiles. So this pattern will become very normal for you. You'll send a service request. When that service request is back, you'll parse the data, you'll inject the data into a template, and then you'll pass that injected template into your page in some fashion. All right, that's all. Oh, nope, there's one more. Just kidding. All right, so this one is about handlebars partials, and this is that sometimes it's helpful for a handlebars template to call or load another template. This can be helpful, or it can help keep templates simpler and more flexible. So imagine the situation where you have a list of items. And so what we've done so far is we've called a service request, we've gotten the data back, and then we've injected that data into a template that has, say, an each loop that's looping through each of the items we got back and showing each of those items. Well, there may be times where those items are something that we want to deal with individually rather than always in the context of that loop. So it can be helpful to separate out that single item into a different partial file or a template file. We can load that template file just like we do any other, like you can see on the left here. So, but once we've loaded it, perhaps this is in the preload function or something like that, we just have to call handlebars.registerPartial. We give it a name, in this case Lego item, and then we associate that name with the actual compiled template, in this case Lego item TPL. So once we've done that, then we can actually use that alias, the Lego item alias, in our template directly in this fashion over here on the right, where we have the double curly braces and then a wicket, and then we call that alias. So the result, I should say, is that we can loop through these items when we have a whole set of items, but we also have the Lego item itself as a separate template that we can call independently if we want to. So something to tuck away and something you will see in the exercise 13. Well, folks, it's been a blast working through all of these lessons with you. I hope you've got a lot of takeaways, and I'm excited to see where you go in your last project here. And wish you the best.